So that's all about reciprocity and trading favors. I'll do something for you, Will, if you do something for me. And yeah, that seems like a pretty safe way to live your life. I wondered if that was the most productive and effective way to live your life. And the answer was a very clear maybe.
Hello Sales Nation and welcome to today's episode of the Salesman Podcast. On today's show we have Adam Grant, author of Give and Take, a whole bunch of other crazy successful books as well, which you can find on Amazon, and we link to them in the show notes to this episode over at salesmanpodcast.com. And on this episode we're diving into why you need to both give, take, and why you need to be conscious about the taking side of things. We always talk about on the show this idea that you should add more value, just add value, and the business will come. That is not the case, and there's data that shows all of this. So, with all that said, let's jump in to today's episode. Adam, welcome to the Salesman Podcast.
Thank you, Will.
I'm glad to have you on. I was ego stroking you perhaps before we click record. I'll do it again. I'm a huge fan of your work, so I know there's going to be a lot to go at very specifically with this episode. And I want to start with this idea of sales experts, gurus, authors, like yourself and others within this realm. They're all telling us, and I think rightly from my gut, but they're telling us that we should add more value and that will help us close more deals. Is there any data, any evidence, anything other than anecdotes and gut feeling that this is the best way to do business?
Yeah, so look, I would say as an organizational psychologist, my job is to ignore the gurus and look at the data. And I've been studying salespeople about as long as I can remember, in part because I started my own career in advertising sales. And I found that basically there are three styles, as you know, that salespeople bring to their relationships. The takers, who are always asking, what can you do for me? And trying to get as much as possible from their clients and customers. On the other end of the spectrum, we have givers, who are really in the mindset of, what can I do for you? And they're excited to help, to share their knowledge, to add value. And what most people in sales do is they say, look, I don't want to be so selfish to be a taker. I don't want to be too generous to be a giver. So I'm going to choose this third style called matching. And what matchers do is they try to keep an even balance of give and take, quid pro quo. So that's all about reciprocity and trading favors. I'll do something for you, Will, if you do something for me. And yeah, that seems like a pretty safe way to live your life. I wondered if that was the most productive and effective way to live your life. And the answer was a very clear maybe. So the interesting thing in the data is the givers were consistently the worst performers. They had the lowest revenue. They were the ones who, like if they saw a client or a customer who, was a little bit uncertain, they didn't want to push too hard. And they'd say, what, I'm really here to help you. So, feel free to walk away. And they lost business because of that. And then, we wonder, okay, if the givers are the worst performers, who are the best performers? And it's not the takers, because takers get all these short-term sales, but they really often struggle to build relationships and trust. And over time, that hurts them more and more, as you well know from your experience. And so most people think, well, the matching approach is the most effective, but it's not. The data actually show that the best salespeople are also givers, that givers are overrepresented on both extremes. So they make up the least productive and the most productive salespeople. And I think that what successful givers do is, first of all, they recognize that, a short-term sacrifice often has a long-term benefit. The goodwill you build when you focus on what's really best for your customer is critical. And secondly, they find ways to give that actually don't cost them a whole lot, as opposed to just giving away the farm with every client or customer. So we do have good data that if you're thoughtful about how you help, then that can actually be a source of advantage as a salesperson.
How do we know where we sit within this? Because I bet there's a whole load of, and to use yours and the book's terminology, there's a whole load of givers who are like, yeah, I'm in it for the long term. I'm building these awesome relationships. And then perhaps they even get fired before these relationships kind of materialize in their brain. So clearly they're being, and maybe this is too much of a masculine or strong word, but perhaps they're being too soft to make it within sales and to have both the long-term and the short-term mindsets and attitudes all wrapped up and have success in that. So how do we know whether we are building these long-term relationships that we're going to have huge success from versus just not being proactive and not being aggressive enough with the deals that are on the table in front of us?
It's a great question. And, I think the clearest pattern in the data is that there are basically two kinds of givers. If you break it down, there are givers who only care about their clients and customers. and are not concerned at all about their own success. And those are the ones who fail, right? Because it's always about how can I make sure that I'm serving your interests, and my interests aren't even on the table, which is a recipe for disaster. That's not only true in sales, it's also true when you study negotiators. Negotiators who only care about their counterpart's outcome and have no concern for their own end up failing pretty miserably. And the other approach that you see among successful givers is they say, look, I can care about other people and also have my own goals and ambitions. And what I'm trying to do is achieve both simultaneously. So I want to create deals that are going to, to help you, but also help me. And, it's really cliched to say that they look for win-win. And yet sometimes that's what happens. In other cases, they say, look, I'm just going to try to protect myself against the cost of giving. So I'm going to help my customers out as long as it doesn't mean I'm, sticking my own neck out or I'm hurting my own success. And then, in situations where I might be tempted to do more, I'm not going to give a deep discount that ends up losing my organization money. I'm going to try to find other ways to address my clients' or customers' interests. And so, I think the real question that defines whether you're likely to fail or succeed if your orientation is toward giving is to ask, okay, am I being so altruistic that I've lost sight of my own objectives? Or am I trying to balance the effort I put into serving my clients and customers with also protecting my organization's best interests?
For sure, because I guess when you drill it down even further, there's perhaps three stakeholders. There's the company you're working for, because I've been in this situation, and as a younger sales professional, I didn't quite get this of, I'd go to my manager and be like, well, if we just give X discount, we're going to win the business. And it was clearly a lack of business acronym that the profit margins are shrinking, and so my position there is actually costing the business money versus the deal going through and making it, even though I was going to make my commission on it. You've got the stakeholder of you as an individual. Clearly, you need to hit your company's objectives that they've set for you, and maybe they need to come first. Maybe we need to be selfish of you need to be able to do these deals profitably over the longer term versus going for the other way around, which is putting the stakeholder of the customer first and just do, as you described, doing everything that they want you to do and sucking it up and hopefully coming out for a longer term income. But there's something that you really kind of piqued me with here, my interest. Now, I've read the book and I'm intrigued as the difference here. What's the difference between a giver that's going for a win-win, to use that cliche, versus a matcher? Because they seem pretty similar on that surface level.
Yeah, I think it's often hard to tell at first sort of which approach you're dealing with when you meet a salesperson. I think the key difference is matchers expect something back from every person they help. And so, like, Will, if I were selling to you and I gave you a discount, I would expect you to then refer me a bunch of other customers. And that would be part of sort of like the exchange. I'm like an accountant in all my relationships. I'm like, okay, like no credits, no debits, everything's got to zero out and be perfectly even. A giver in that same situation would say, look, maybe I'm going to give some discounts where I can afford to do that and where, I think a customer has a real need. But I'm not going to expect anything back from that customer. I'm just going to assume on balance that, if I can bring more generosity into the world, that, at some point, those people will pay it forward and we end up with, more people who are willing to operate that way, which is probably net positive for our business. But I don't have any expectations or obligations when I do something for you that you owe me something back. And I think that turns out to be the key difference.
For sure. I know from my experience doing the podcast and growing the show and getting guests like yourself, Adam, I find that if I give, just put a random arbitrary number on it, doesn't really mean anything. But if I give 3 whatever units of value to 10 people, I'll find that out of those 10, I'll get 20 back from one individual. So as you described, net, it always seems to work out. And we might nerd out a little bit here and scare the audience a little bit, but where does all this data come from? We don't need to go super deep into the statistics and I've got a degree in chemistry. I'm trying to think back of all the statistical analysis that I used to do, which you might have an interest in. But how do we measure all this, and how do we kind of like dataize it and make it real so that someone like yourself can write a book on this?
Yeah. So I mean, the good news is that the performance metrics are much more clear in sales than almost any other job I've studied. So, when we're able to track revenue data, that's really useful. Sometimes we'll also look at, customer retention and referral rates. But most of the sales studies I've done have been looking at revenue over time. And, what's neat about that is, you can then see pretty clearly that for a lot of givers, it looks like they're failing because you only have their first quarter or their second quarter results. And then if you wait until quarters 3 and 4, that's when you start to see them really pull out ahead of the takers and matchers. And then, the hard question is, how do you measure whether somebody is a giver, taker, or matcher? We can't trust your self-report. There are tons of takers wandering around thinking they're givers. Right? And I actually noticed that, when I introduce these styles, what people often say is like, hey, I'm a giver. And the moment somebody says that, I'm like, nope, you're a taker.
Yeah.
Because the real givers are too busy helping other people to wave a flag and say, look how generous I am. And the best data that we usually get are either peer ratings or customer ratings. So, people can as they get to know, their colleagues or, their sales professionals better, they can judge these styles pretty accurately and consistently. So in an ideal study, we might get 3 different people to evaluate you. And then we look at like, okay, do they agree on whether, your motives are primarily giving, taking, or matching? And then in some of the studies, we actually have hard data on behavior. So we would know, for example, how much time you spend helping your colleagues with their own, sales challenges, as opposed to just focusing on your own job. And so by looking at how you treat your coworkers, we can get an indication of, what your worldview and what your values might look like.
For sure, it makes total sense. And so I want to take this one scale further now. So regular listeners know this, but part of my passion within the sales industry and something that I want to give a bit of a kick in the arse and change up is both this negative stereotype of salespeople, which is perhaps another conversation in itself, but also the career pathways of sales professionals. Because it seems like for a lot of salespeople, they feel like the only next step is management. So I want to take this conversation into the career long-term, a decade, 2 decades from where a sales professional comes in, they have some success, and then whether they end up as CEO, CSO, sales ops, whatever it is, have this in the back of the mind of the conversation that we're having here, Adam. And that is, if we're doing things the right way, but our sales manager perhaps wants us to do things the way that they did it, which may have been 10 years ago, 15 cold calls every morning, and then it would have been faxes for them, but perhaps another 20 emails on top of that. And there's a process in place, and clearly there's some value to the process, but as an individual that if you do things your own way, or if you take the process and improve it and iterate on it, and essentially you've got this desire and this need to be a nonconformist within your sales team, and you're having success from that, should that be encouraged? And I'm less concerned about the sales manager here, more concerned about the individual who's listening to this, who's getting told off on one side of the table by the sales manager for not following the rules that they've set in place for them. And then the other side, they can see that perhaps nonconformists do better over the long term than people who just follow the rules. Is there something to that?
Yeah, I think there is, Will. It's a great segue from the questions I was excited about for Give and Take to the more recent work I've done for Originals. And my favorite study in the whole book, hands down, is this study by this economist, Mike Hausman, who shows that if you use Chrome or Firefox, you have significantly higher job performance, and you tend to stick around 15% longer than people who use Internet Explorer and Safari. And this is a study he did of over 50,000 people. Most of them are working in sales jobs. And what he shows is, at first we thought it might be a technical advantage. Like people who use Chrome or Firefox are a little bit more computer savvy, but it actually turns out that computer knowledge and typing speed across the different browser groups are pretty much identical. And it's really about where you got your browser, because if you use Internet Explorer or Safari, those just came pre-installed on your computer, and you accepted the default option that some random person handed to you. Whereas if you wanted Chrome or Firefox, you had to question that default and ask yourself, I wonder if there's another browser out there, and then be a little resourceful and go and download it. So I worry a lot that when people hear about this evidence, they're like, wait, so if I want to get better at my job, I just need to download a new internet browser? No.
If it was that simple, I don't think the show would probably exist. It'd be like a one-page PDF.
It's much more about being the kind of person who has the instinct to reject the default, right? Who, you approach your whole job by saying, look, I don't want to live in an Internet Explorer world. Instead of just doing, following a standardized sales process or, the job description that was created for, a bunch of other people, I'm going to ask, is there a better way to do this? And then I'm going to take the initiative to customize the job to my own skills. And ultimately, that ends up being a huge advantage when it comes to how effective you are at sales.
Is this a learnt skill, or you use the word then instinct? Is it something that's in our DNA? There's certain individuals that, for better or worse, from a management perspective, they are just disruptive. They're just happy to change things and mix things up. Is it something that we learn over time that we can perhaps mold and change, or are some people just, they have the DNA of, I don't know wherever it come from, of 100,000 years ago, they were chased out the village, and so they had to survive in the own in the woods, and there's epigenetic and all kinds of crazy things that go on to mold that DNA.
Yeah, so like everything in psychology, it's always a little bit of nature and nurture. There is, from a personality perspective, people vary on what gets called the proactive personality. How much do you tend to take initiative across different situations, and instead of waiting for direction, sort of creating your own opportunities. But this can be learned pretty quickly and easily. And one of the ways that I've looked at this in some other studies of salespeople is when you look at introverts and extroverts, everyone believes that extroverts are better salespeople than introverts. We know that they're socially skilled and energetic and gregarious, and that's supposed to be an advantage. And yet, when I conducted a study of salespeople, I found there was, on average, not a significant difference between how well introverts and extroverts did, and they were, both groups, outperformed by a third group that's called ambiverts. So what? Ambiverts are people who fall right in the middle of the introvert-extrovert spectrum, which is actually most of us. It's more and more rare as you go further and further to the extremes to find people. And so, most of us are somewhere in the middle. We like our quiet moments. We also, enjoy our social interaction. And the ambiverts were dramatically more successful than introverts and extroverts. And I think the reason is they were less likely to stick to one strategy or style or process of selling. The extroverts, their comfort zone was to be assertive and outgoing, and they ended up talking too much and not listening enough, which meant they learned less about their customers and clients. And they also came across as a little bit too pushy. And the introverts kind of had the opposite problem, right? They asked so many questions and they did so much listening that they were less likely to get around to actually selling at some point. And the ambiverts were much more adaptable. They would say, look, I'm going to find the right balance between talking and listening. I don't have sort of a personality comfort zone that I'm sticking to all the time. I'm going to try to, adjust to what's going to be most effective for this sales process. And, I think that's really good news for most of us, because most of us are ambiverts, and that means most of us are kind of wired to do the kind of nonconformity and adaptability that's necessary for dynamic selling.
Is there a way to improve our ability to be proactive? Because I guess some of this comes down to just sheer confidence or sheer push from, if you need to pay your mortgage and you're doing rubbish this particular quarter, you need to think differently to go about hitting that target, perhaps. So there's other factors that kind of pull into this. But is there a way that we can accelerate this process, other than, hopefully this show makes everyone aware of it, but yeah, that next step, if there's a practical way to go about it, would be crazy useful for the audience.
Yeah, look, I think when you look at what drives people to be proactive, part of that is motivation, which can come from having higher aspirations or being in a real position of need. And the other part of it is knowledge and skill. There are a lot of people who are highly motivated, but they just don't have the information they need to figure out, okay, what would be another effective strategy that I could try? And I think the more you learn about creative and unexpected ways that people are approaching their job, the easier it is then to put those into action. And then, as you sell differently, you get different customer and client reactions, which sort of opens the door to trying out a whole set of additional new strategies. And my favorite example that I've come across in the past couple of years is this entrepreneur named Rufus Griscom. So Rufus became a father and found out that everything he'd ever been told about parenting was just a lie. Nobody told him about the sleepless nights and the constant feelings of deep inadequacy when you can't even reason with a 5-year-old. And he decided he was going to start a parenting website called Babel that was going to tell people the truth about what it was like to have kids. and he needed funding for it. So he goes to venture capitalists and he starts pitching his idea. And Rufus includes in his pitch, he says to all of the investors, here are the 3 reasons why you should not invest in Babbel. And this is insane, right? Like, for anybody who watches like Dragon's Den or Shark Tank or any of the, kind of entrepreneur pitching shows, what you normally see is like they put their best foot forward and they tell you all the reasons to invest. And I'd never seen, anybody in selling anything saying, here's why you should not accept what I'm about to try to offer you. But Rufus walked away with 3.1 million US dollars in funding that year. And then 2 years later, he goes to Disney and they've had a conversation about, possibly acquiring his company. And he includes in his big pitch a slide deck that says, here are the 5 reasons that you should not buy Babbel. And they end up buying it for 40 million US. So there's something going on here, and part of it, of course, is an attention grabbing device. It's like a marketing gimmick. It surprises you, and then you're a little bit more curious, and you're like, wow, this guy's a serious nonconformist. I wonder what he's going to say next. And you kind of admire the fact that he's willing to go against the grain. But it's more than that. I think what's so powerful about it is he shows that he's able to be balanced and honest and self-critical. That he's not so in love with his product and his idea that he can't see it accurately. And he not only does that, he also makes it harder for his investors to think of their own objections. So, what happens is like these investors, they're like, I had 2 big concerns about this pitch, but Rufus already acknowledged both of them. And then they have to work harder to come up with their own concerns. And the harder they have to think about what's wrong with the business, the less they think there is wrong with the business. And the one extra piece is, venture capitalists love to show off how smart they are. And normally they'd be like, Rufus, I think this is a cool idea, but I've already seen like your 3 fatal flaws, and I'm really sorry that I have to let you down this way. But now they're like, he already covered the flaws. Let me show off by saying, hey, Rufus, those 3 problems you pointed out? I could fix those in a heartbeat. They're nothing.
Yeah.
And by the end of it, they've talked themselves into this, not being a problematic company at all. And look, I don't think that everybody should sell all the time by saying, here's why you shouldn't buy from me, or here's why my product sucks. I do think, though, that this is something we are all taught to do in debate class, to acknowledge the weaknesses of our arguments and address counter arguments. And when we get into selling mode, we forget to do that. And it just comes across as a lot more trustworthy to say, look, here's this product. Here's what I think the upsides are. Here are the genuine limitations that it has. And, I think the strengths outweigh the limitations, but I just wanted to be upfront with you about them.
So it seems like, and tell me if I'm wrong here, Adam, because I could very well be. It seems like it's almost like a 1 + 1 = 3 scenario of you have what works in sales, and then you add it with something that is either counterintuitive or just something totally different, which allows you to break through the noise, get attention, all the stuff that we're striving to do constantly, but it's tied in with the process that we know and there's data on and that we trust. And that gives a better result than just sticking with one or the other. So what I want to ask you is, for the salesperson listening now, what's the best way to, it's almost like a comfort zone, to get out of their comfort zone so that they can use the knowledge they've got and then use this alternative, extra, add-on, whatever you want to describe it. How do we uncover what those things are? Is it reading somewhat related books? So if you're in sales, reading books about marketing, perhaps? Is it TED Talks? What is it? What can we do to ignite those little sparks?
Yeah, look, I think they're definitely reading sort of adjacent books is a useful strategy, because I think that you're the least likely to get really original ideas about sales from books about sales.
No comment.
But if you go a little bit outside that and you look at Bob Cialdini's recent book Persuasion, Dan Pink's book To Sell Is Human, the Heath brothers Switch. They're all looking at fundamental questions of influence and persuasion, which, sales is obviously a natural setting to apply those skills. And, I think that's where a lot of creative ideas come from. I also think that actually practicing selling outside of your core domain is really useful. So one of the things I used to do when I was hiring salespeople was I would pick just the least desirable products I could find. And as part of the interview, I would ask people to try to sell them to me or to some unsuspecting people in the office. So my favorite one was I would ask people to come in and try to sell a rotten apple. And yeah, the logic was like, from a hiring perspective, if you could sell a rotten apple to me, you could literally sell me anything. And there were great pitches. Like I had somebody say like, these may look like rotten apples, but they're actually aged antique apples. And like if you've heard the saying like an apple a day keeps a doctor away, well, you only need to eat these once a week. And I was like, wow, you're a genius, and I have concerns about your ethics now.
That's literally what I was thinking as the opportunities to try and pitch this throughout my mind was going through. Of it's in one hand, you can probably sell ice to Eskimos as a cliche way of describing it. On the other hand, it probably shows that you're an absolute crook and like morally kind of insecure and not the right person for the company. There's a weird balance there.
It's funny though. People actually found workarounds to that. So one of the other great pitches that I got was, I'm actually not selling apples. I'm selling apple seeds. And, I'll sell you this rotten apple cheaper than you'd have to buy seeds in the store. And you can plant an apple tree in your backyard, it'll be great.
Yeah.
And what I like about this from the salesperson's perspective is when you have to sell something that's unfamiliar to you, you don't start with your usual sales process. You kind of throw that out the window and you go back to the drawing board and you end up testing much more creative approaches than you would have otherwise. And so I think we should all practice, at least a couple times a week, just selling something that we're not already comfortable selling.
For sure. As you're saying that, Adam, I can envisage this of, so I used to hate sales meetings and meetings with sales managers because there was very little usually that I would take away from them. And this is obviously down to the manager. I've got no management experience, so I might be totally off here. But from my personal perspective, it seemed like it was more a data collection exercise versus a useful time or coaching exercise from my perspective. But it seems like if we had the sales team all sat around a table, all with a bag, and we all pull something random out of it, and we've all got to try and pitch it and sell it, and I guess there's a learned skill, this ability to think on your feet and to solve objections and to just be able to have higher level conversations very quickly. That seems like a useful exercise just in itself.
What I love about that, Will, is not only do you get the practice, of testing out all kinds of new strategies on the fly, but you also get to see your colleagues do the same.
Uh-huh.
And that gives you a bigger repertoire of ideas that you might test out when you're in your own sales situations. And from working as a salesperson, then from hiring salespeople, and then for more than a decade studying salespeople, I don't think in most sales positions people do enough learning from each other. There's so many cool strategies and tips that we can pick up from our colleagues, and most of the time we're either too busy thinking I have to be in contact with customers all the time, or there's a little bit of competition going, and so I don't want to share too much. And I think that's a huge missed opportunity.
Definitely, totally agree. And with that, Adam, I'm going to wrap up here, mate, because I could literally talk about this, especially going nerdy with the data and go deep into it all day. But I've got one final question that I ask everyone that comes on the show. You should have some, I guess, unique insights on this as well. So I'm excited to hear your answer. And that is, if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at selling? I would actually give some advice that comes from some really cool new data to continue the nerd factor. So Justin Berg at Stanford just finished this study where he shows that if you take all the ideas you have for solving a creative problem, and you can apply this really nicely to like, all right, what's the sales strategy that I'm going to use, and you rank them from your favorite approach to your least favorite approach, like 1 to 10, the best strategy, the most creative approach, is usually not the one you rank first, it's the one you rank second. Wow.
And what happens is your favorite idea, it's like, it's your pet approach, and you fall so in love with it that you can't really see what's wrong with it. And you end up sort of being blinded by your own passion for it. Whereas your number 2 idea, you're like, all right, I can see this with a little bit more distance. I can see that, it has some imperfections, but you also have enough enthusiasm for it that you're motivated to fix the problems. And I think that I had a lot of tunnel vision when I was selling, and I was like, I found like my one way to sell, which was like I'd build a relationship right up front and, try to just connect with the person. And there were times when I did that really effectively. And there were other times when I failed to see that, the person was really busy and they didn't want to have like a, 10-minute conversation. They just wanted to get the deal done. And I kind of annoyed them, and it hurt the process. And I think that I would have benefited a lot from realizing, if I take a step back, there are a couple other ways to initiate the conversation that will then help me figure out, okay, is this somebody who wants to build a relationship or somebody who really wants to be productive in this conversation? And I really missed out on that.
I love it. And there's almost two levels of insight there. Of one, we shouldn't go with our first choice, but then, we should debate the legitimacy of it with all the biases that we have. But then two, we should probably think of more than one option, because I know a lot of the time it's the pitch or the email or the important conversation or the flow of the meeting or however we want to narrow this down and pigeonhole it. We probably only just put down on paper our first idea, and maybe we don't even go beyond that. So there's two levels of insights there. So I appreciate that, Adam. And with that, mate, we've mentioned a couple of the books here. So tell us a little bit more about them and where we can find out more about you personally as well.
Oh, sure. Thanks. So website is adamgrant.net. It has everything I've ever written. There's an assessment where you can figure out if you're a giver, taker, or matcher. You can rate yourself. You can get other people to rate you. And then there's also a quiz on your nonconformity and proactivity. And the only things that aren't on there, of course, are the books that my publisher does not allow me to give away for free. There's there's the difference between self-sacrifice and keeping your own goals in mind too. So Give and Take is really about how giving, taking, and matching shape our success. Originals is about how nonconformists achieve their goals and try to influence other people as opposed to just following the crowd. And new book coming out later this month, Option B, with Facebook COO Sheryl Sandberg. We wrote about resilience and how to face adversity and find strength in all kinds of difficult situations. So that's me in a nutshell.
Amazing stuff. Well, congratulations and good luck with the book launch. We'll link to all of that in the show notes to this episode over at salesmanpodcast.com. And with that, Adam, I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for joining us on the Salesman Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
And there we have it. Adam, thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate your time, your insights on this. And thank you guys, Sales Nation, as always, for tuning in. And with all that said, I'll speak with you again on tomorrow's episode.